Are modern ethical theories successful in uniting motivations and reasons? In this video lecture, we're going to look at the schizophrenia of modern ethical theories by Michael Stocker. So Stocker says that most modern ethical theories deal only with reasons, values, and justifications. So in the case of reasons, right, they want to know what is that structure of a supreme principle of morality, such that one can know whether or not their rationale for engaging in an action is ethical or not. In a sense, they kind of plug it into the moral equation. Modern ethical theories are interested in values because they want to know what is that good which all other goods or all other values are subsumed by. What is that one thing? Is it pleasure? Is it right? Is it something else? Well-being? They're also interested in justifications, because justifications are certain kinds of ways of reasoning that we might have about particular situations, such that those things which we actually might think are intuitive might not be justified, or perhaps our intuitions are justified, and that ethical theory is going to tell us whether the way we live in an everyday sense actually lines up with what is ethically permissible or not. Now, because modern ethical theories deal only with these things, Stocker says that modern ethical theories fail to examine motives and the motivational structures and constraints of ethical life. That they, in a sense, take reasons, values, justifications, even obligations. They take these and abstract them away from their actual particular situations. Now, one claim that Stocker makes is that the mark of a good life is a harmony between one's motives and one's reasons, values, and justifications. So, to some extent, this is an assumption he's going to make about what it means to live the good life. But I think he's also making this claim because he thinks this is something intuitive. This is something that basically everyone is going to agree with. That it would seem like, well, if we're going to live the good life, there has to be some harmony, some way in which we have a relationship that is not fractured between our motivations for wanting to do the right thing and the justifications, the rational account of why we should do that right thing. So Stocker says not to be moved by what one values, what one believes good, nice, right, beautiful, and so on, bespeaks a malady of the spirit. Not to value what moves one also bespeaks a malady of the spirit. Such a malady, or such maladies, can properly be called moral schizophrenia, for they are a split between one's motives and one's reasons. So, not to be actually moved by what you value, so not to have the kind of desire to do what you think is right, is a kind of dysfunction of the spirit, of your mind, of yourself as a person. But also not to value what moves you, not to be justified or seek justification for what you desire, bespeaks a malady of the spirit as well. This is what he thinks occurs in modern ethical theories, for example, in the case of utilitarianism, other consequentialisms, deontology, even contractualism. That in some way or another, there's a disharmony in how the human being is actually meant to engage with those theories and act on them. We might wonder, though, is harmony in thought overrated? Is harmony in ethical life? And is harmony between our motivations and reasons overrated? So Stocker admits, right? Sometimes we don't want a harmony between reasons and motivations. So in the case of, say, a self-seeking authoritarian or a murderer, we don't want it to be the case that a self-seeking authoritarian is not only going to be motivated to be an authoritarian, but also they have a rational justification for being an authoritarian. Right? That would in some way be undesirable, perhaps both in terms of our instinct, in terms of our desires, but also in terms of undesirable of the good, of what the good life, of a good society, of good government. We wouldn't want there to be this kind of harmony between reasons and motivations in the murderer. And here, in the sense of murderer, what is in mind is someone that's like perhaps psychopathic, one that's murdering for the wrong reasons, not murderer in the sense of self-defense, maybe like defending yourself against someone who's broken into your house trying to kill you or something like that. In this case, we wouldn't want this harmony for the murderer, because then we would say, well, the murderer is not only desiring and acting on their desires to kill people, but they're actually morally or logically justified in doing so. There would be something wrong with that picture. We also can admit that there shouldn't be a harmony between reasons and motivations in all cases. Like we might say, well, we don't have to have a harmony in the case of feeding the sick. It's just the right thing to do, and you don't have to it's not the case that to do good you have to always feel good about doing the good. Maybe sometimes you have an obligation to help the less fortunate. So, Stocker says, it is commonly agreed that you can do what is right, you can do what is obligatory, you can do your duty, and so on, without motive. Again, looking at the case of feeding the sick, without having to take pleasure in feeding the sick, but just doing it because it's the right thing. So Stocker says, if it is your duty to keep a promise, you fulfill that duty no matter whether you keep the promise out of respect for duty, fear of losing your reputation, or whatever. What motivates is irrelevant so far as rightness, obligatoriness, duty are concerned. So this is what defenders of modern ethical theories would argue, he thinks, how they would defend themselves against this idea that you always have to have a harmony between motivations and reasons. But Stocker actually thinks there are two problems with this defense of modern ethical theories. First, there's still a question of harmony. What sort of life would it actually be that people would live who did their duties but never or rarely wanted to? Second, focusing solely on duty, obligation, and rightness tends to leave out other, perhaps more important areas of ethics, the values of personal and interpersonal relations and activities, moral goodness, merit, and virtue. So, we have his two claims here. Modern ethical theories are schizophrenic. He says, they necessitate a schizophrenia between reason and motive in vitally important and pervasive areas of value, or, alternatively, they allow us the harmony of a morally impoverished life, a life deeply deficient in what is valuable, such that, 1, modern ethical theories are schizophrenic because they end up separating what we find valuable, like interpersonal relationships and so on, and what we have reason to actually do. This kind of a life seems to be a dysfunctional life, one that we might actually not desire at all. But secondly, they're schizophrenic because for them to be harmonious, it would have to be the case that we would have to give up those other values, like an appeal to beauty, an appeal to interpersonal relationships, love, friendship, for the sake of friendship. And in that way, to live a harmonious life, we would be denying all those other kinds of values. So, modern ethical theories for Stocker are doubly defective. He says, as ethical theories, they fail by making it impossible for a person to achieve the good in an integrated way. As theories of the mind, of reasons and motives, of human life and activity, they fail, not only by putting us in a position that is psychologically uncomfortable, difficult, or even untenable, but also by making us and our lives essentially fragmented and incoherent. We have a similarity to Bernard Williams here in this critique of modern ethical theories, such that modern ethical theories, or as Williams would refer to them as moral theories, theories of morality, or the institution of morality, because they primarily focus on obligation, justification, reasons, those things that Stocker mentioned, they end up focusing on a narrow aspect of ethical life. That if we take ethical life to be the good life as a whole, what it means to live a good life, they want to focus on what does it mean to be moral? What does it mean to do the right thing? Always. For anyone. By doing so, you actually basically cut out a part of the more holistic account of an ethical life, and you end up focusing on that sliver of values to the detriment of all the other values, all the other parts of perhaps what might make us a human being. So Stalker wants to first make his case by considering hedonistic egoism, a theory that's not popular. So, you know, most likely anyone reading this or watching this would say, yeah, of course, there's something wrong with hedonistic egoism. So I can see why you're right about this, Stalker, at least in this particular case. So the question is, can a hedonistic egoist obtain the personal pleasures of love, friendship, affection, fellow feeling, and community? Right, so those might be those other pleasures or values that are outside of that narrow sliver of moral theory. So hedonistic egoism says one ought to always pursue those things which bring them the most pleasure, in a way that is not impersonal, such that it's the greatest pleasure for all, but it's for you. So it's a focus on self-interest. One should always do what they think is in their self-interest, and what is in your self-interest is always maximizing pleasure for you. Now, the reason why Stalker asks this question in this way is that he's going to frame those values of friendship, affection, etc. as kinds of pleasures that one can enjoy. Well, if those are kinds of pleasures, then it would be rational for the hedonistic egoist to pursue those pleasures. So of those pleasures, Stalker says, consider love. It is essential to the very concept of love that one care for the beloved, that one be prepared to act for the sake of the beloved. More strongly, one must care for the beloved and act for that person's sake as a final goal. The beloved or the beloved's welfare or interest must be a final goal of one's concern and action. So, to actually enjoy the pleasure of love, to be in love with someone, or to love someone truly, one has to, in some cases, sacrifice their own interests for the other person. One has to act and think on behalf of that person, and not just because it's what you really want. This kind of love, Stalker wants to point out, is not merely romantic, it's not a merely kind of sexual love, but it's also the kind of love that's held by, say, family members, closest friends, and so on. Such that it might be the case that to be a good friend, you don't lie to them when you find out maybe their boyfriend or girlfriend is cheating on them. Right? Maybe it's for their own benefit that they learn about this, even though it's going to hurt them. Even though perhaps maybe you enjoy hanging out with them as a couple and you enjoy that person and you know, well, if I tell my friend this, it's going to break them up. And that would, you know, make my life not as fun, perhaps. So Stalker says, a hedonistic egoist has good reasons to pursue these kinds of relationships, but they cannot act in ways required to get those pleasures. Such a theory is schizophrenic. Why? Why can't a hedonistic egoist enjoy the pleasure of love? Well, again, if I am going to be prepared to act for the sake of the beloved, if I'm going to care for the beloved because I love them, then I have to be prioritizing them, who they are, over the fact that I want the pleasure that is going to be gained from loving them, right? For the hedonistic egoist, what's primary is the pleasure to be gained from love. But what's required to actually have love is the person in your relationship with that person, your thoughts about the person, your care for that person, etc. That has to be primary. In this way, then, we see the motivations, which are the care for the person, and then the reasons, so what you should do, are at odds with one another with hedonistic egoism, such that the hedonistic egoist can never actually enjoy the pleasure of love, even though it says you ought to pursue those pleasures. Or take the case of community. If you're really going to care about community, then sometimes things you might want, some things you might enjoy, you might have to forego for the sake of the betterment of the community, such that maybe you have solidarity. Right? It might be the case that, say, let's take a worker, okay, in a union. To engage in solidarity, you might have to go on strike. You might have to forego some wages for a period of time. But you would do so if you actually care about your fellow workers. You would do so because it's for the greater good, because it's in the interest of everyone, even though you might lose out on some money that you really need for right now. You can never actually then engage solidaristically in that action, in that communal action, if you're a hedonistic egoist, because it would actually be going against your particular self-interest, and you would be acting in the self-interest of the whole, of the working class as a whole. So again, in this way, this theory is schizophrenic, because the motivations, which are to act for the sake of the working class, and your justifications, which is the basis of hedonistic egoism, the rationale that says you ought to pursue your own self-interest, and your own self-interest is that which maximizes your pleasure, those are at odds. They don't allow you actually, your motivations don't allow you to achieve what the theory says you ought to achieve. Okay, all well and good, right? You know, most people aren't hedonistic egoists. So Stalker says, let's consider utilitarianism. So utilitarianisms that argue we ought to engage in action if and only if it optimizes pleasure or reduces pain are going to fall victim to the same issue of schizophrenia. He says, suppose now you embody this utilitarian reason as your motive and your actions and thoughts towards someone. Whatever your relations to that person, it is necessarily not love, nor is it friendship, affection, fellow feeling, or community. The person you supposedly love engages your thought and action not for him or herself, but rather as a source of pleasure. What does he mean? So, if utilitarianism says you ought to always maximize pleasure for the well-being of everyone and never increase the suffering of others, you might think, well, that allows me to engage in love. That allows me to engage in community, such that my wife, okay, I would never want to hurt her because that would increase her suffering and that would decrease her pleasure and happiness. So clearly it seems like utilitarianism allows us to engage in love. The problem, though, that Stalker's pointing out, is what you're actually focused on is not the person themselves. It wouldn't be my wife. I would be focused on pleasure itself, suffering itself, happiness itself, such that what I'm really committed to is not that person, it's pleasure, it's happiness. Now, what about a kind of utilitarianism, and the kind of that comes from the philosopher G.E. Moore, that says not all the goods are actually identified, such that perhaps love relations and the like are goods. These might be kinds of pleasures that we could pursue and say it is good to maximize these for the well-being of all. Well, Stalker has two responses. First, if you try to carry on the relationship for the sake of goodness, there is no essential commitment even to that activity, much less the persons involved. Again, you're actually committed to those goods as goods, to the objects desired, separate from the actual person you're engaged with. The second problem, even if that good is something special, any other person can fill the role required to realize that special good. So it actually wouldn't be the case that by maximizing the good of a love relationship, it's because I'm with that person, I'm with my wife, Gabriella. It would just be the case that, well, as long as I kind of just take her out of the equation, I put in someone else, and that fulfills the love relation, then, well, good. I also maximize the love relation pleasure in that way. So again, what is actually valued in this case is the kind of relation itself, but not actually the person involved in that relation. Because if any other person can kind of fit in and create that relation and maximize that good, well, then it would be the same. It would be just as moral that I pursue that. In this case, then, what is left out is the actual person themselves that I'm supposed to love. Stalker says deontological theories are no different. Why? Well, if your focus is on duty if your focus is on goodwill, doing the right thing because it is the right thing, it doesn't allow you to prioritize and act on behalf of that person for the sake of that person. Now you might say yes, but deontology says that you should never use someone as a mere means, but always as an end in themselves. So it seems like deontology would say you should treat your wife, you should treat your friend in a way where you act for the sake of them being your friend, for the sake of them being your wife, for the sake of who they are as a person. The problem is, what it really means is to treat them as a person, which is the same as any other person. So again, you can kind of take one person out, put another person in, and the relation is the same. It doesn't matter who they actually are, because all persons possess reason, which is why we should treat them as an ends in themselves and never as a mere means. We can think about the famous murderer at the door example with Kant. If there's a murderer at the door, knocks on my door, says, hey, is your wife home, or is your friend home? I hate them and I want to kill them. Well, Kant says, according to the categorical imperative, you should never lie. But clearly, if I never lie in this situation, my justification, my reasons, are at odds with my motivations, which is the care and concern for the person. Now, Kant says, yeah, but what if the person snuck out the back door, they're running down the street, and when you lie to the murderer, they turn around because they're going to walk away, and they see the person in the street. Well, then you can't guarantee your outcome, so you could have actually produced a bad outcome, even though you cared about them. The problem is, of course, this is a very far-fetched situation that is unlikely to occur, and again, it also shows that you're not acting because you truly love that person, you truly care for them. You're acting because of what is good in and of itself. You're acting for the sake of a goodwill. You're not acting for the sake of the person. In this way, then, our motivations, which is to care for the person, are at odds with our reasons, which say you shouldn't, lie to someone just because to protect the person that you love. How can you have genuine friendship? How can you have genuine love if you're a utilitarian, if you're a deontologist? Modern ethical theories do not value the beloved. It's not simply that they do not regard people as valuable, because they do. We saw with deontology, all persons are valuable. We see with utilitarianism that all persons are valuable, and in fact, it's not only people that are valuable, all sentient beings are valuable. So it's not as if these are ethical theories that don't value people. The problem is they value impersonalism. They value people in this abstract sense and not actually particular people. If this is the case, then it's unclear how you can ever have friendship or love, how you can engage in all those other kinds of spheres of life in an authentic way. So Stocker says, love, friendship, affection, fellow feeling, and community, like many other states and activities, essentially contain certain motives and essentially preclude certain others. Among those precluded, we find motives comprising the justifications, the goals, the goods of those ethical theories most prominent today. To embody in one's motives the values of current ethical theories is to treat people externally and to preclude love, friendship, affection, fellow feeling, and community, both with others and with oneself. To get these great goods while holding those current ethical theories requires a schizophrenia between reason and motive. It means to actually have love, to have friendship, affection, fellow feeling, and community, you would have to lead two different lives. How is that even possible? And is that desirable? So lastly, Stocker considers a couple objections. The first objection: modern ethical theories are not intended to supply what can serve as both reasons and motives, but they're only intended to supply indices of goodness and rightness, not determinants. So in this case, the objection would say, well, look, if you want to say there's this whole sphere called ethical life, modern ethical theories are concerned with just a sliver of those things, concerning duty, justification, etc., then why are you mad that they're not also, concerned with the other parts of the theory? It seems like you misunderstand the theory because you're mad that they don't talk about, let's say, love and friendship in a certain way, and instead they focus on justification, reasons, and duty, and obligation. But Stalker replies by saying, why should we be concerned with theories then that cannot be acted on? If we want to say, okay, utilitarianism, deontology, contractualism, that these kinds of theories are only concerned with a small sliver of ethical life, why would we even care about those theories then if they can't be integrated with larger ethical life? What's the value of them? The second objection then. Modern ethical theories are first concerned with rightness, obligation, and duty. And then it's actually within this realm that they do not suffer schizophrenia. So within the realm that's only interested in rightness, obligation, and duty, they don't suffer schizophrenia because motivation and reasons are in harmony. Only if you're concerned with rightness, obligation, and duty. Stalker replies to this with 3 points. First, they're mistaken about these concepts. What it means to be concerned with rightness, obligation, and duty isn't something that can just be divorced as if it's not related or implicated by the other concerns of love, friendship, community, affection, and so on. Second, these theories are dangerously misleading since they are all too readily taken as applying to the whole of ethics, since most people do actually use these theories to apply to the whole of ethics as if reading and studying and acting on those ethical theories is living the good life. Finally, the acceptance of these theories as only partial theories suffers problems of integration within ethical theory as a whole. That even if you say, well, within the theory itself it doesn't suffer schizophrenia, okay, but going back to that first reply to the first objection, what's the point of it? You can't integrate it into the whole of ethical life because you have this schizophrenia. You have this disharmony between reasons and motives. In this way, then, this objection fails to convince us as to why we should even value these theories in the first place, because they don't seem to allow us to live the good life, if that's what ethics is concerned with.